On the morning of October 12th, 1851, a woman's scream tore through the humid silence of the Briarwood Plantation in coastal Georgia. Before we begin, please leave a comment with where you are watching and the exact time you are listening to this narration. The locations and times of day or night that these verified stories reach are of interest to us. What Charlotte Vance witnessed in her husband's private study that morning would unleash a scandal so profound that local newspapers refused to print the details for over half a century. Within 3 days, more than 300 citizens would gather in the town square of Port Royal to witness a punishment so brutal, the memory of it would be carried to their graves. The county court sealed every document related to the case until 1923. When historians finally unsealed them, they discovered the truth was far darker than any rumor. This was not just a story of betrayal. It was the story of the complete and public annihilation of a man's soul, orchestrated by the one person who knew exactly how to turn a community's rage into a weapon. Port Royal, Georgia, in the 1850 seconds, was a town built on beautiful contradictions. Spanish moss hung from the ancient live oaks like funeral shrouds, both elegant and suffocating. The air was a mixture of salt, marsh, and magnolia blossoms, a sweetness that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of decay. This was a place where immense fortunes rose from the fields of rice and cotton, all worked by the hands of the enslaved. Here, white-columned mansions stood in silent competition, each vying for the most impressive display of wealth and power. The Vance family sat at the very pinnacle of this society. Julian Vance, 35 years old in 1851, had inherited Briarwood Plantation from his father 7 years earlier. It was a sprawling estate of 3,000 acres of prime land, with a Greek Revival mansion completed in 1842. Crystal chandeliers, imported from France, hung in the grand ballroom. The heart pine floors were so perfectly joined that the seams were invisible. Julian was the very picture of a Georgia gentleman, tall, dark-haired, with broad shoulders from years of riding. He dressed impeccably, spoke with the slow, measured cadence of old money, served on the town council, and was a deacon at his church. He was known as a fair master, a term used at the time to mean he did not whip his slaves as often as his neighbors did. But Julian Vance had a secret, and that secret was about to destroy everything he had ever known. Charlotte Vance, born Charlotte Delany, had married Julian in 1845. She came from a powerful Charleston family, with a fortune that rivaled the Vances. The marriage, like most among the elite, had been an arrangement, a strategic union designed to consolidate the power and wealth of both families. She was beautiful in the way her society demanded. Her skin was pale, protected from the sun. Her dark hair was always perfectly arranged. Her waist was corseted to a fashionable, painful narrowness. She had been educated at Charleston's finest academy, where she was trained in French, piano, watercolors, and the subtle, ruthless art of managing a large household while appearing to do nothing at all. Their wedding had been the social event of the season. 400 guests had gathered at St. Michael's Church. Everyone said they made a perfect couple. Everyone said their children would be beautiful. But 6 years into their marriage, there were no children. This fact was whispered in parlors across the county, always with that cruel mixture of pity and judgment that society reserved for women who failed in what was considered their primary duty. Charlotte felt the weight of those whispers in every room she entered. She saw the thinly veiled disappointment in her mother-in-law's eyes. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that her value as a wife diminished with each childless year. What Charlotte did not fully understand was why there were no children, why Julian came to her bed so rarely, why he seemed so distant, his mind always somewhere else, even when his body was in the room with her. The truth lived in the quarters, the neat rows of cabins that stood behind the grand house. The truth had names: Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and a boy named Samuel. Marcus was 24, the son of the plantation's head cook. He was light-skinned, with features that hinted at a mixed ancestry no one ever spoke of openly. He had worked in the main house since he was 15, first as a footman, then as Julian's personal valet. He was intelligent, able to anticipate his master's needs before they were spoken, and he moved through the house with the silent grace of a shadow. Isaac was 26, and he worked in the stables. He was darker than Marcus, with a muscular build from years of hard physical labor. His hands were equally skilled at managing the plantation's prized horses and at repairing fine leather. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, an inner strength that the brutality of slavery had not managed to break. Julian had taken notice of him 3 years earlier and had begun finding more and more reasons to visit the stables. Elias was 21, a house carpenter renowned for the detailed woodwork the plantation required. He was slight, almost delicate, with long, artistic fingers and a quiet, watchful eye. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was soft and careful. He had learned early in his life that for a man like him, invisibility was a form of survival. And then there was Samuel. He was the youngest, just 19, and worked in the gardens, tending to the roses and camellias that were Charlotte's pride. He was quiet, almost shy, with a gentle nature that seemed at odds with the brutal world of the plantation. Julian had taken an interest in him only recently, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the other 3 men. Julian had been careful, so very careful. He met with them, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone, but never all together, always late at night in the west wing of the mansion, a section of the house that Charlotte never went into. That part of the house was supposedly being renovated, closed off, and unused. Julian had created a private sanctuary there, a room with its own entrance from the gardens. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with a large bed, heavy curtains to block the windows, a sturdy lock, and oil lamps that cast a soft, forgiving light. For 3 years, this secret life had continued. Julian maintained his public persona perfectly. He attended church every Sunday. He conducted his business with a ruthless efficiency. He smiled at his wife across the dinner table. And then, late at night, while Charlotte slept alone in her separate bedroom, as was proper for a lady of her station, Julian would descend the servants' stairs, cross the darkened gardens, and enter the west wing, where 1 or more of the 4 men would be waiting for him. These men had no choice. They were his property. When their master summoned them, they had to come, whether they felt desire or fear, or a soul-crushing resignation, or a complicated mixture of all 3. Their feelings were irrelevant. For them, survival meant compliance. Refusal meant a punishment too terrible to contemplate. The whip, the selling block, a permanent separation from their families. So they came when they were called. They kept silent, and they told themselves that at least they were safe from the back-breaking fieldwork that destroyed other men. They had slightly better food, slightly better clothing, the small, poisoned privileges Julian granted them in exchange for their silence and their bodies. But secrets, no matter how carefully they are guarded, have a way of revealing themselves. In a house where dozens of enslaved people moved through the shadows, where wives lay awake at night listening to the creaking of floorboards, where jealousies and resentments simmered beneath the surface of every polite interaction, a secret of this magnitude could only stay hidden for so long. Charlotte had noticed things, small things at first. Julian always locking the door to the west wing, the way he seemed energized on certain mornings, almost cheerful after weeks of a distant, brooding moodiness. The particular tension in the way Marcus moved through the house, his eyes never quite meeting hers. The fact that Isaac was always in the gardens late at night when he should have been in the quarters. The faint bruises she sometimes saw on Elias's neck, marks that looked like they could have been made by fingers or by lips, and the way Julian had started to praise the roses, a new and uncharacteristic interest. Always after a late-night walk in the gardens where young Samuel worked, she had noticed all these things and had pushed them away, because the alternative was too monstrous to consider. No, Southern gentleman, no man of Julian's standing, would do such things. It was impossible. It was unnatural. It was a violation of the laws of God and nature and of every principle of their civilized society. But Charlotte was not a fool. She had been raised in a world where women learned to observe, to read the subtle signs that men believed they were hiding. 6 years as the wife of an increasingly distant husband. 6 years of enduring the pitying looks and whispered conversations of her peers. 6 years of feeling her worth as a woman diminish with each passing. Childless years slowly, like water seeping through the cracks in a foundation, the truth had begun to penetrate her carefully constructed denial. On the night of October 11th, 1851, Charlotte made a decision. She would know the truth. Whatever it was, however terrible it might be, she would see it with her own eyes. Charlotte waited until the house was dark and still. She heard Julian's footsteps in the hallway, heard him descend the servants' stairs. She gave him 10 minutes, enough time to reach the west wing, to settle in, to believe he was safe in his secret world. Then she rose from her bed, wrapped a dark shawl around her white nightgown, and followed him. The garden was lit only by a sliver of a moon and the faint, distant glow from the slave quarters. Charlotte moved carefully, her bare feet silent on the cool brick paths. She could hear the chirping of crickets in the grass, the far-off sounds of the river, and her own heart, pounding so hard she thought it might wake the entire plantation. She reached the west wing. The side door was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Charlotte approached slowly, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She peered through the narrow gap in the door. The room was larger than she had expected, and it was furnished with a care that made it clear this was no temporary arrangement. A large bed dominated the space, covered in fine linens that Charlotte recognized as missing from the household inventory. Oil lamps cast a warm, soft light across the scene. Julian was on the bed, unclothed, his body intertwined with not one, not two, but 4 other men. Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and young Samuel were with him, moving together in ways that left no doubt about what was happening. The sounds, the intimacy, the obvious, practiced familiarity of their movements spoke of an ongoing, comfortable relationship. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the scream that was rising in her throat. She stood there, frozen, unable to look away, unable to process what she was seeing. Her husband, the respectable planter, the church deacon, the pillar of his community, was engaging in acts that were not only illegal, but were considered the deepest, most unspeakable depravity. In 1851, Georgia, what Charlotte was witnessing was a crime punishable by death, not just for Julian, but for all 4 of the enslaved men as well. The law made no distinction and showed no mercy. The act itself was called sodomy, a word so terrible it was rarely spoken aloud. It was considered an abomination, a sin so profound that even to discuss it could corrupt a decent person. Charlotte watched for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. She watched Julian kiss Marcus with a tenderness she had never, in 6 years of marriage, experienced herself. She watched Isaac's hands move across Julian's back with an obvious, practiced familiarity. She watched Elias whisper something that made Julian laugh, a genuine, unguarded laugh that she had not heard in years. And she saw young Samuel, his face a mixture of fear and something she could not name, drawn into the center of it all. In that single, shattering moment, watching her husband show more authentic emotion and desire for 4 enslaved men than he had ever shown for her, Charlotte felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. It wasn't just betrayal, though that was certainly there. It wasn't just humiliation, though she felt that too. What she felt was rage, a pure, focused, calculating rage. She had given this man 6 years of her life. She had endured the whispers and the judgment. She had diminished herself, trying to be the perfect, childless wife. And all the while, he had been here, in this room, with these men, living his true life, while she lived a lie. Charlotte backed away from the door, her mind already racing. She returned to the house, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat at her writing desk. Her hands were steady now, her breathing was calm. She lit a candle and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She began to write 3 letters, one to Julian's mother, one to Sheriff Charles Brodie, and one to Julian himself. In each letter, she described what she had witnessed, sparing no detail necessary to convey the full horror of the scene. She sealed all 3 letters, then walked to Julian's door and slid his letter underneath. She returned to her room, lay down on her bed, fully dressed, and waited for the sun to rise. Julian found the letter at dawn. He picked it up from the polished heart pine floor, the crisp white of the envelope, a stark anomaly in the dim morning light. He broke the seal, his fingers clumsy, and read. The color drained from his face. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake uncontrollably. He read the letter 3 times, as if the sheer force of his will could rearrange the words written in his wife's elegant, unforgiving hand. But the words remained, each one a nail in his coffin. Charlotte had seen him. She knew everything. And she had already written to the sheriff and his mother. Julian's first instinct was pure animal panic. He could run. He could saddle his fastest horse, ride north, and simply disappear into the vastness of the continent. But where would he go? He was a plantation owner, a man whose entire identity, whose very existence, was inextricably tied to this land. He had no skills beyond managing enslaved labor and maintaining his family's social position. Without Briarwood, without the Vance name, he was nothing, a ghost with no past and no future. His second instinct was denial. Perhaps he could convince Charlotte she had misunderstood what she had seen. Perhaps he could persuade her that she had been dreaming, that the strain of their childless marriage had finally affected her mind. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew they were the desperate, foolish fantasies of a condemned man. Charlotte had described details, the specific pattern of the linens on the bed, the half-empty bottle of French whiskey on the table, the exact positions of the 4 men that proved beyond any doubt she had witnessed the scene with a horrifying clarity. His third instinct was a surge of rage. How dare she? How dare she threaten him, her husband, the master of this house, and everything in it? But the rage died as quickly as it had risen, collapsing under the crushing weight of a single, undeniable truth. He was guilty. He had betrayed her, had lived a monstrous lie. And in the rigid, merciless moral universe of the antebellum South, what he had done was unforgivable. He walked to Charlotte's bedroom and knocked softly on the door. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It was locked. He knocked again, harder this time, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. "Charlotte, we must talk, please." Her voice came from behind the door, as calm and as cold as river stone in winter. "There is nothing to discuss, Julian. The letters have been sent. Sheriff Brody will be here within the hour. Your mother will arrive shortly after. I suggest you use whatever time remains to make your peace with God, since you will find no peace in this world." Julian pressed his forehead against the cool, unyielding wood of the door. "Please, Charlotte, I can explain. Explain how you have spent 3 years defiling yourself and your slaves. Explain how you have made a mockery of our marriage, our name, and the very laws of God and man. There is no explanation that could possibly matter, Julian. You are a sodomite. That is what you are. That is times all times you are. And by sunset, everyone in this county will know it." Sheriff Brody arrived at 7:30 a.m. with 2 deputies. Charlotte met them at the door, still dressed in her night clothes, a dark shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She invited them inside, offered them coffee, and explained the situation with the calm, measured tone of a woman reporting a property dispute. The sheriff was a large, imposing man, 60 years old, with a graying beard and eyes that had seen every variety of human wickedness the Georgia coast could produce. He had known Julian since he was a boy. He had attended the wedding. He had been a guest at their Christmas parties. As he listened to Charlotte describe what she had witnessed, as he read her detailed, unflinching account, his face darkened with a mixture of betrayal, disgust, and the cold, grim determination of a man who knew exactly what the law required of him. "These are serious charges, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the most serious a man can face in this state." "I am aware, Sheriff. That is why I sent for you immediately. My husband is in his study. The 4 slaves he was with are in the quarters. I want them all arrested. I want this matter handled according to the full and terrible extent of the law." The sheriff nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the opulent, sunlit room as if seeing it for the first time. "Where did this incident occur?" "In the West Wing. There is a room there, furnished for this very purpose. You will find everything exactly as I have described it." Sheriff Brody motioned to his deputies. They moved through the grand house with Charlotte leading the way. She showed them the West Wing, the side door, the room itself. The bed was still unmade. The oil lamps were still burning low, their light now pale and sickly in the morning sun. The evidence of what had occurred was everywhere, stark, irrefutable, and impossible to deny. The sheriff's jaw tightened. This was a violation not just of the law, but of the entire social order. Julian Vance was one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the county, a pillar of the community. And now, he would have to be destroyed, publicly and completely, because the alternative to let such a transgression go unpunished would be to shake the very foundations of their society. "Arrest Mr. Vance," the sheriff told his deputies, his voice flat and hard. "Take him to the town jail, then go to the quarters and arrest the 4 slaves, Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and the boy, Samuel." The deputies moved to the study. Julian did not resist. He stood when they entered, set down his glass of whiskey, and held out his wrists for the shackles. His face was a blank mask, empty of all expression. He looked at Charlotte once, as they led him past her in the hallway. She met his gaze without flinching, her eyes as hard and as bright as diamonds. "I hope you understand what you have done," Julian said quietly, his voice raspy. "This will destroy you as much as it will destroy me." Charlotte smiled, a cold, terrible smile that did not reach her eyes. "I know exactly what I have done. I have revealed you for what you truly are. I will survive this, Julian. I will return to Charleston, to my family. I will be the wronged wife, the innocent victim of your unspeakable depravity. But you will be nothing. Just a name people whisper with disgust, a cautionary tale told to frighten young boys, a warning about the consequences of unnatural vice." Julian said nothing more. The deputies led him outside to a waiting wagon. Within minutes, he was on his way to the Port Royal town jail, shackled like a common criminal. His fall from grace was so sudden, so absolute, it seemed almost unreal. Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel were taken from the quarters in chains. Their families watched in silent, helpless horror, understanding that their loved ones were caught in a storm that would almost certainly end in their deaths. In 1851 Georgia, enslaved people had no legal defense against such charges. If a white person, especially a white woman of high standing, claimed they had participated in sodomy, their guilt was automatically assumed. They were, in the eyes of the law, already condemned. By noon, all 5 men were locked in separate, lightless cells. By evening, everyone in Port Royal knew. The news spread like a fever, whispered in shops and parlors, discussed in horrified tones over dinner tables, debated in taverns. Julian Vance, the respectable planter, the church deacon, was a sodomite, caught in the act with 4 of his male slaves. His own wife had discovered him and reported him to the law. The scandal was so enormous, so shocking, it dwarfed every other topic of conversation. Nothing else mattered except this one terrible, fascinating revelation. The week between Julian's arrest and his trial felt suspended in time, as if the entire town of Port Royal were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, brutal conclusion. They had never experienced a scandal of this magnitude. They had seen murder, theft, adultery, drunkenness, violence. All the usual sins had passed through their courthouse. But this was different. This touched something deeper, something more primal and more terrifying. It was a violation so profound it threatened the very order of their world. Judge Howard Sinclair presided over the county's legal proceedings. He was 68 years old, a veteran of the War of 1812, known for his strict, unwavering interpretation of the law and his absolute commitment to maintaining the social order. When he received the documents related to Julian's arrest, he sat in his chambers for over an hour, reading and rereading the charges, his face growing grimmer with each pass. He had known Julian since he was a child. He had signed his marriage license. He had approved the loans for the expansion of Briarwood. Now, he was being asked to preside over Julian's complete and utter destruction. The law was clear. The Georgia statutes defined sodomy as the abominable and detestable crime against nature, prescribing a punishment of either death or such lesser penalty as the court deemed appropriate, though the statutes strongly implied that death was the preferred option. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The act itself, if proven, demanded the harshest of consequences. But Judge Sinclair faced a complication. Julian was white, wealthy, and from one of the founding families of the region. Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel were enslaved, property legally worth perhaps $800 each. The law, in theory, applied equally to all. But in practice, everyone knew that the enslaved men would be punished more severely and more quickly. The real question was how to handle Julian without creating a precedent that might threaten other wealthy white men who had secrets they preferred to keep hidden. On October 15th, Judge Sinclair called a private meeting in his chambers. Present were Sheriff Brody, the county prosecutor Richard Davies, 3 prominent citizens including the mayor, and 2 church deacons. Charlotte was not invited. No one representing Julian was invited. "Gentlemen," the judge began, his voice low and somber, "we face a situation that requires both justice and discretion. The charges against Mr. Vance are supported by unimpeachable evidence. His wife witnessed the crime directly. The physical evidence corroborates her testimony. If this were any other man, any man of lesser standing, we would proceed directly to conviction and sentencing, without hesitation. But it is not any other man." Mayor Thomas Elliott interjected. "It is Julian Vance. His family has been a part of this community for 3 generations. His plantation employs hundreds, directly or indirectly. If we execute him, what happens to his property, his slaves, the debts he owes, and the debts owed to him?" Prosecutor Davies, a thin, hawkish man with wire-rimmed spectacles, shook his head firmly. "With all due respect, Mayor, we cannot allow considerations of wealth or status to interfere with the course of justice. If we treat Mr. Vance differently than we would a poor farmer or a shopkeeper, we undermine the very foundation of our law. The crime is the same, regardless of who commits it." "Davies is right," Sheriff Brody added, his voice a low growl. "I have the man in my jail, and the 4 slaves who participated. If we let any of them escape justice, what message does that send to the community? That the wealthy can do whatever they wish, that the law applies only to the common folk?" Reverend Samuel Caldwell spoke, his voice grave with the weight of moral certainty. "This is not merely a legal matter, gentlemen. It is a spiritual crisis. What Mr. Vance has done is an abomination in the eyes of God. It corrupts the natural order and threatens the moral foundation of our society. If we show mercy, if we soften the punishment, we suggest that such behavior is somehow forgivable. We cannot do that. We must not." Judge Sinclair nodded slowly, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Then let me propose a course of action. We will hold a trial. Given the circumstances, a conviction is certain, but I will use my discretion in the sentencing. Mr. Vance will not be executed." The room erupted in a chorus of objections, several men speaking at once. The judge raised a hand for silence, his authority absolute. "Hear me out," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Death would be a mercy for a man in his position, a quick end, a closed coffin, a private burial. His family could mourn and move on. No, what I propose is far worse than death. A public punishment of such severity that Julian Vance will wish we had hanged him. We will destroy not just his body, but his soul, his reputation, his very identity. We will make the entire community witness his degradation so that everyone understands exactly what happens to men who commit this crime." "What form would this punishment take?" the prosecutor asked, his eyes narrowing. The judge's expression was as cold and as hard as granite. the pillory and the whipping post in the town square. But not for an hour or two. For 3 full days, he will be locked in the pillory from dawn to dusk, exposed to the elements, the insects, the jeers and curses of anyone who passes, and at noon each day he will receive a public whipping, not enough to kill him, but enough to scar him permanently, enough to ensure that for the rest of his life he carries the marks of his shame on his body. The room fell silent. Even the men who had been most insistent on a harsh punishment seemed taken aback by the calculated brutality of the proposal. "And the slaves?" Reverend Caldwell asked quietly. "They will be hanged," the judge said without a moment's hesitation. "They are property who corrupted their master. They seduced him into his depravity. They will serve as an example of what happens when slaves step beyond their proper place. Their executions will precede Mr. Vance's punishment by 1 day, so that he knows what his actions have cost them." Sheriff Brody frowned, a rare expression of dissent on his weathered face. "That is not just, Your Honor. By all accounts, Vance initiated these relationships. The slaves had no choice. They could not refuse their master. Justice and necessity are not always aligned, Sheriff." The judge replied, his voice devoid of all emotion. "The law requires that all participants in sodomy be punished. More importantly, the white citizens of this community need to see the natural order restored. White men may fall, but they fall from a great height. Slaves who participate in such acts must be eliminated entirely. It is a harsh solution, but it is the only way to maintain control." The men in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded their agreement. The solution satisfied no one completely, but it balanced the competing demands of the law, the social hierarchy, and the need to make a public example that would resonate far beyond Port Royal. But Judge Sinclair had not factored in the cold, calculating fury of Charlotte Vance. She was not invited to the private meeting, but she had sources. One of the judge's own clerks, a young man named Benjamin Porter who was courting Charlotte's cousin, overheard the conversation and repeated it to his fiancée. The news reached Charlotte within hours. When she learned of the plan, she was not satisfied. She had wanted Julian destroyed, but she had not considered that Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel would be executed. Despite her rage at her husband, she understood, on some level, that these 4 men had been trapped in an impossible situation. They were property. They had no choice but to obey their master's commands. To execute them for Julian's depravity seemed like a miscarriage of justice, even by the twisted standards of their slave society. But Charlotte also understood something else, something far more important to her. If the 4 enslaved men died before Julian's public punishment, if they were hanged and buried before the town witnessed his humiliation, then Julian would become a martyr of sorts. People would whisper that he had loved his slaves, that he had sacrificed himself for them, that there was something tragic and romantic about his fall. Charlotte could not, and would not, allow that narrative to take root. Her revenge had to be absolute. There could be no room for sympathy. She sent a note to Judge Sinclair, requesting a private meeting. He agreed, curious as to what the woman at the center of the scandal could possibly want. They met in his chambers 2 days before the trial. Charlotte arrived dressed in full mourning black, though no one had yet died. It was a deliberate choice, a visual representation of the death of her marriage, her hopes, and her future. She sat across from the judge with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her expression as calm and as hard as polished marble. "Your Honor," she began, "I have heard of your intended sentence for my husband and the 4 slaves involved in his crime." The judge raised an eyebrow. "That was a private discussion, Mrs. Vance. How did you come to know of it? In a town of this size, Your Honor, very little remains private for long. But I am not here to question your authority or your judgment. I am here to make a request." "Speak, then." "I request that the punishment of all 5 men occur simultaneously, that Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel not be hanged separately, but be present during my husband's 3 days in the pillory. that they be forced to watch what becomes of the man who used them, and that my husband be forced to watch their executions on the final day, after his own punishment is complete." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying her with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. "That is a remarkably cruel request, Mrs. Vance, even for a wronged wife." "My husband showed me no mercy, Your Honor. He showed our marriage no respect. He showed God's law no reverence. Why should I show him any mercy now? Why should he be granted the dignity of being punished alone, where he can imagine himself a victim? Let him see what his desires have caused. Let him watch those 4 men die, knowing that his actions brought them to the gallows. Let the entire town see the complete picture of his depravity and its terrible consequences." Judge Sinclair was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Your request is granted. I will modify the sentence accordingly. The trial will proceed in 3 days. The punishment will begin the day after the verdict, and it will be exactly as you have described." Charlotte stood, smoothed her black skirts, and offered the judge a small, cold smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. Justice should be complete. The entire story should be told. Nothing should be hidden." The trial began on October 18th, 1851. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, crowded the doorways, and pressed against the windows, trying to hear every word. This was not just a trial. It was the social event of the decade, a spectacle that would be discussed and debated for years to come. Julian was brought in wearing shackles. He had not been allowed to change his clothes since his arrest. His once fine shirt was stained and wrinkled. His face was gaunt. His eyes were hollow. He looked like a man who had already died inside, simply going through the motions of living, because he had no other choice. Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel were brought in separately, also in chains. They were made to stand in a corner of the courtroom, guarded by armed deputies. Their faces showed a range of emotions. Marcus looked resigned, almost peaceful, as if he had accepted what was coming. Isaac's jaw was set, his eyes burning with a quiet, contained rage. Elias was trembling, tears running silently down his face. Young Samuel, the youngest of the 4, could not watch at all. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to bear the sight of the crowd. Judge Sinclair took his seat. The prosecutor rose and presented the charges. Then, Charlotte was called to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head held high. She wore dark gray now, still a color of mourning, but slightly less severe. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she described in exact detail what she had witnessed on the morning of October 12th. The courtroom was utterly silent as she spoke. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Women fanned themselves, whether from the heat or from the shock. It was impossible to say. Every word Charlotte uttered was like a hammer blow, destroying Julian's reputation, his dignity, his very humanity. When she finished, the prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Vance, is there any possibility that you misunderstood what you saw?" "No, sir," she replied, her voice unwavering. "There is no possibility of a misunderstanding. What I witnessed was clear, unmistakable, and deliberate. My husband was engaged in the act of sodomy with 4 of his male slaves. He was not coerced. He was not confused. He was participating willingly and enthusiastically in acts that violate every law of God and man." The defense attorney, a young man named William Crawford, who had been assigned to Julian's case and clearly wished he had not been, stood for the cross-examination. "Mrs. Vance, is it possible that your husband's behavior was the result of a temporary insanity, that he was not in his right mind?" Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "My husband has been engaging in this behavior for at least 3 years, Mr. Crawford. That is not a temporary insanity. That is a deliberate choice. That is who he is." Crawford tried a few more questions, but each one only made Julian's situation worse. Finally, he sat down, defeated. There was no defense to be made. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness unshakable. Julian was asked if he wished to testify. He simply shook his head. What could he possibly say? The truth was undeniable. Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel were not allowed to testify. As enslaved people, they could not give evidence in court except in very limited circumstances, and this was not one of them. Their guilt was assumed, based on Charlotte's testimony and the physical evidence from the room. They had no voice, no chance to explain or defend themselves. They simply stood in the corner, waiting for the inevitable verdict. Judge Sinclair addressed the jury. Though everyone in the room knew their decision had been predetermined, "Gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. The law is clear on this matter. Sodomy is a crime of the highest order, an abomination that threatens the moral fabric of our society. You must now determine whether the accused are guilty of this crime." The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. "We find the defendant, Julian Vance, guilty of sodomy." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some voices expressed a grim satisfaction. Others sounded genuinely shocked, even though the outcome had been certain from the start. "We find the slaves Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel guilty of sodomy and of corrupting their master." This second verdict was delivered more quietly, almost as an afterthought. The fate of the 4 men had never really been in question. They were already dead in the eyes of the law. The jury was simply making it official. Judge Sinclair nodded. "The court accepts the verdict. We will now proceed to the sentencing." He paused, letting the tension in the room build. Every person in the courtroom leaned forward, waiting to hear what punishment would be decreed. "Julian Vance," the judge began, his voice echoing in the silent room, "you have been found guilty of the abominable crime of sodomy. The law permits me to sentence you to death, and many in this community believe that would be an appropriate punishment. However, I believe that death would be too merciful. You have violated not just the law, but the sacred trust of your position. You have corrupted your slaves, abused your authority, and brought shame upon your family and this community." Julian closed his eyes, waiting for the rest of the sentence to fall. "Therefore, I sentence you to 3 days of public punishment. You will be locked in the pillory in the town square from dawn to dusk. At noon each day, you will receive 20 lashes with the whip. You will be marked permanently, so that for the rest of your life, you will carry the evidence of your crime upon your body, and you will witness the execution of the 4 slaves whose lives you have destroyed with your unnatural desires." A gasp went through the courtroom. 3 days in the pillory was brutal enough, but a total of 60 lashes would leave a man scarred and broken for life, and forcing him to watch the executions was a form of psychological torture that many found excessive, even given the severity of the crime. As for Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel, the judge continued, turning to face the 4 enslaved men, "You are sentenced to death by hanging. The execution will take place in the town square on the afternoon of the 3rd day of Julian Vance's punishment, so that he may witness the consequences of the corruption he brought upon you." Elias, the gentle carpenter, collapsed. The deputies caught him before he hit the floor, holding him upright. Isaac's face remained impassive, but his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. Young Samuel could not watch at all. He kept his eyes on the ground, his body trembling. Marcus, however, did something unexpected. He looked directly at Julian, who was still standing in the defendant's box, his face a mask of numb despair. Their eyes met for a brief, silent moment, and something passed between them, some final, terrible acknowledgement of the strange and tragic relationship they had shared. Judge Sinclair struck his gavel. "This court is adjourned. The sentence will be carried out beginning tomorrow at dawn. May God have mercy on all your souls." The courtroom erupted in a buzz of conversation as people filed out. Some were satisfied that justice had been served. Others were disturbed by the severity of the sentence. And many were already planning to attend the public spectacle, drawn by a morbid curiosity and the knowledge that they were about to witness something that had never happened in Port Royal before. Charlotte left the courtroom without looking at Julian. She had achieved what she had set out to do. The truth was public. Julian was destroyed. and she would soon be free to leave this place and never return. Morning came too quickly. The sun rose over Port Royal, casting a pale, golden light across the town square. Already, people were gathering, their numbers growing with each passing minute. Prominent citizens had chairs set up for them, while others stood in hushed, expectant groups. Children had been kept home, but teenagers and adults filled the square until there was barely room to move. In the thick center stood the pillory, a crude wooden frame with holes for a head and hands, and beside it, the whipping post, a thick wooden pole with iron rings for securing the condemned. Both had been freshly painted, as if someone wanted them to look their best for this historic, brutal occasion. At dawn, Julian was brought from the jail. He wore only his trousers, his torso bare, his feet without shoes, his hands bound behind his back. The deputies led him to the pillory and locked him into position, his head and hands secured, his body bent forward, completely immobilized. The morning sun was already hot. Within an hour, he was sweating. Within 2 hours, flies had found him. Within 3 hours, his back was burning from the sun, and his legs were shaking from the strain of standing in one position, and the people watched. Some jeered and called out insults. Others simply stared in silence. A few might have felt a flicker of pity, but they kept it to themselves, knowing that to express sympathy for a sodomite would be to bring suspicion upon their own character. Charlotte arrived mid-morning, accompanied by 2 female relatives from Charleston who had come to support her. She stood at a distance from the pillory, not close enough to speak to Julian, but close enough that he could see her if he raised his eyes. She wanted him to know she was there, witnessing his humiliation, ensuring that it was absolute and complete. Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel had been brought from the jail and forced to stand at the edge of the square, chained together, guarded by deputies. They watched Julian's punishment with varying reactions. Marcus kept his expression neutral, showing nothing. Isaac watched with a grim satisfaction, perhaps glad to see the man who had used him, now suffering himself. Elias could not bear to look, keeping his eyes on the ground, and young Samuel, his face pale with terror, simply wept. At noon, the real punishment began. Sheriff Brody approached the command, pillory with a long leather whip. The crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on the scene that was about to unfold. "Julian Vance," the sheriff announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have been sentenced to 20 lashes. May this punishment serve as a reminder of the consequences of your crime, and as a warning to any other man who might be tempted to follow your path." Julian's body tensed. He had been whipped once as a child, a few light strokes for some minor mischief, but that had been nothing compared to what was coming. He tried to prepare himself, but there was no preparing for this. The first lash came without any further warning. The leather strip cut across Julian's bare back with a sharp crack that echoed across the square. He gasped, but did not cry out. A thin red line appeared on his skin. The second lash followed quickly, then the third. By the 5th lash, Julian was groaning with each blow. By the 10th, he was crying out, unable to maintain his composure. By the 15th, he was sobbing, his body shaking uncontrollably with each impact. The skin on his back was torn in multiple places, blood running down to soak into the waistband of his trousers. The 20th lash finally came. Julian sagged in the pillory, held upright only by the wooden frame that imprisoned him. The crowd was silent now, their initial excitement replaced by the uncomfortable reality of watching a human being be broken. Sheriff Brody coiled his whip and stepped back. Julian would remain in the pillory until sunset, still exposed, still suffering, but at least the whipping was over for today. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the afternoon stretched on endlessly. People came and went, some staying for hours, others just passing through to see the spectacle with their own eyes. Finally, as the sun approached the horizon, the sheriff returned. He unlocked the pillory, and Julian collapsed immediately, unable to stand. The deputies caught him, dragging him back to the jail, where a doctor had been ordered to examine him and ensure that he would survive to endure the next 2 days. The second day began exactly like the first. Julian was brought out at dawn, locked into the pillory, exposed to the sun and the insects and the jeers of the crowd. His back was a mass of scabbed and infected lacerations from the previous day's whipping. Every movement pulled at the wounds, sending fresh waves of pain through his body. Charlotte returned, as she had the day before. She stood in her black dress, her face shaded by a parasol, watching without expression. People had begun to whisper about her, calling her cruel, calling her vindictive, but they also understood her rage. She had been wronged in a way that few women could even imagine. At noon, the whipping began again, 20 more lashes across Julian's already damaged back. This time, he screamed from the very first blow. There was no dignity left, no strength to maintain any semblance of composure. He screamed and begged and pleaded for mercy, but none came. The law had decreed 20 lashes, and 20 lashes he received. When it was over, his back looked like raw meat. The doctor would later comment that he had never seen a man whipped so severely and survived. But Julian did survive, though there were moments when he clearly wished he had not. The third day arrived. Julian was brought to the pillory for the final time. His body was barely recognizable. His back was covered in blood-soaked bandages. His face was swollen from sun exposure and insect bites. His legs could barely support his weight. But the sentence was clear. 3 days in the pillory, 3 sessions of whipping. The law would be fulfilled. The crowd that day was the largest yet. Word had spread throughout the county. People had traveled from neighboring towns to witness the conclusion of Julian Vance's punishment and the execution of the 4 enslaved men. The square was so packed that the deputies had to form a perimeter to keep the crowd from pressing too close to the pillory and the gallows that had been erected overnight. The gallows were a simple but effective structure. A wooden platform with 4 nooses hanging from a crossbeam. They had been positioned so that Julian, locked in the pillory, would have a clear and unobstructed view of the executions. This was Charlotte's final gift to her husband, the knowledge that his desires had directly caused these men's deaths, and the obligation to watch as they died. The final 20 lashes came at noon. Julian barely reacted this time. He was beyond screaming, beyond begging. He simply endured, his body jerking with each impact, blood flowing freely from the reopened wounds. When the whipping finally ended, he hung limply in the pillory, more dead than alive, but he was conscious. That was important. The doctor had been instructed to keep him conscious, no matter what, because he needed to witness what came next. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel were brought from the jail. They walked through the silent crowd, their chains clanking with each step. They climbed the steps to the gallows platform. Reverend Caldwell stood on the platform, waiting. He held a Bible and attempted to offer them some final prayers. But Isaac interrupted him. "Save your prayers, Reverend," Isaac said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his fear. "We do not need the prayers of a God who has allowed this to happen. If there is a God who sees what is happening here today and does nothing to stop it, then that is no God at all." The Reverend recoiled as if he had been struck. "You blaspheme in your final moments?" "I speak the truth in my final moments," Isaac replied, "which is something that no one else in this town seems capable of doing." Marcus spoke next, his voice calm and clear, looking out at the crowd. "You call us criminals. You call us corruptors. But we never had a choice. When our master called us, we came. That is what slaves do. We survive, however we can. And now, you kill us to protect your own sense of order. Remember that. Remember what you did here today." The executioner, a man named John Kelly, who served as the county's designated hangman, placed the nooses around each man's neck. He adjusted them carefully, then stepped back and waited for the signal from Judge Sinclair, who stood at the base of the gallows. The judge looked at his pocket watch. At exactly 2:15, he nodded. The executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoors beneath the 4 men opened simultaneously. They dropped, the ropes went taut, and their necks broke with audible cracks that carried across the silent square. They died quickly. That was the only mercy afforded them. Their bodies swung gently in the afternoon breeze, 4 men who had been property in life and remained property even in death. Julian watched it all. He watched Marcus die. He watched Isaac die. He watched Elias die. He watched young Samuel die, and something inside him broke in a way that no amount of physical punishment could have broken. He made a sound, a low, wailing cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his shattered soul, a sound of anguish and despair and guilt that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. The bodies were left hanging for an hour, as was the custom, to ensure that death was complete and to serve as a final, gruesome warning. Then they were cut down and loaded into a wagon. They would be buried in unmarked graves at the edge of town, in a section reserved for criminals and for the enslaved who died without a family to claim them. Julian was finally released from the pillory at sunset. He collapsed immediately and had to be carried back to the jail. The doctor examined him and declared that he would survive, though his recovery would be long and painful. Judge Sinclair came to Julian's cell that evening. He looked down at the broken man lying on the cot, barely conscious, covered in bandages, his spirit as damaged as his body. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice cold and formal, "you have served your sentence. You are free to go, but understand this, you are no longer welcome in Port Royal. You are no longer welcome anywhere in Georgia. If you remain here, if you attempt to reclaim your property or your position, you will find that society has closed its doors to you permanently. My advice to you is to leave. Go west, go north, go anywhere but here, and pray that no one where you land ever learns your name or your history." Julian said nothing. There was nothing to say. His life as he had known it was over. Everything he had been, everything he had worked for, was gone. He was a ghost now, a living reminder of what happened to men who violated the unwritten rules of Southern society. 3 days later, after he had recovered enough to stand and walk with assistance, Julian left Port Royal. He took nothing but the clothes on his back and a small amount of money the court had allowed him to keep. Briarwood Plantation was sold at auction to pay his debts. The enslaved people, including Marcus's wife Rachel, were sold separately to various buyers throughout the region. The house was purchased by a family from Charleston, who renamed it and tried to erase all connection to the Vance name. Julian Vance disappeared into the vastness of America. Some said he went to Texas. Others claimed he died within a year, unable to survive without the privilege and protection he had always known. A few whispered that he went to California during the gold rush and lost himself among the thousands of other men who were running from their pasts. But no one ever knew for certain. Julian Vance simply ceased to exist, as thoroughly as if he had been executed alongside Marcus, Isaac, Elias, and Samuel. Charlotte returned to Charleston, as she had planned. She resumed her maiden name, Delany, and told everyone her husband had died. In a sense, this was true. The man she had married no longer existed. Her family welcomed her back, sympathetic to her ordeal, understanding that she had been the innocent victim of a monstrous deception. She never remarried. She lived quietly, managing her inheritance, attending church, and maintaining the appearance of a respectable, grieving widow. But people who knew her said something had changed in her eyes, something hard and cold that had not been there before. She had destroyed her husband completely, and in doing so, she had perhaps destroyed something in herself as well.